However, when I was following this discussion on net neutrality and open access, I thought having words probably is not a worst thing on earth, because this discussion is a fantastic proof of the power of words. Network neutrality, open access have such a positive connotation that the natural intuition of almost everybody inevitably leads to a positive perception of the context. And the interesting thing to me is, at least the academic discussion in Europe and the legal area, the burden of proof has, without any compelling reasons, been shifted to those who are critical towards network neutrality or open access. The open access discussion, I think, has another fascinating dimension. Many people are talking about it, but nobody really seems to know what it means. It seems to be generally accepted that open access could become a key component, not only for the nationwide rollout of broadband internet infrastructures, but also for the reduction of access and price regulation for next generation networks. One of the most prominent proponents of this approach, the German regulatory agency, has issued guidelines on the regulatory framework for the development of modern telecommunication networks and the rollout of high-capacity broadband infrastructures. I haven't found an English translation, so it's my own translation, and you might correct me if I did something wrong here. But guideline 1 says, the Bundesnetzagentur welcomes, and here's a quote, projects that comprise the construction of high-capacity telecommunication infrastructures, which third parties is granted access to on non-discriminatory, transparent, and open terms, open access. In this case, the Bundesnetzagentur might refrain from imposing regulatory remedies. When I first read this, I assumed that open access is a clearly defined concept, if not only the Bundesnetzagentur, but also the market players in a public consultation seem to agree on the fact that open access is a promising regulatory strategy. I got a little bit frustrated when I was looking for such a clear definition. However, I felt better when I then read in the guidelines that even the Bundesnetzagentur says, considered the term open access needs to be defined and should be discussed in the NGA discussion group. And even guidelines for the application of state aid rules in relation to the rapid deployment of broadband networks by the European Commission state that infrastructure that is supported by state aid should be open for 7 years. There should be an open access regime without further explaining what an open access regime should look like. So we know now 7 years apparently is one of the key characteristics of open access, at least as far as the European Commission talks about it. In this presentation, I will first try to find a very general definition of open access for my purposes here, and I know there are others out there. Afterwards, I will argue that the time is ripe to find ways to reduce ex-ante access regulation for next-generation networks to a minimum, not only because the law demands such a step, but also in order to ensure that nationwide broadband infrastructures are actually constructed as soon as possible. In a third step, I will evaluate whether open access can actually be an effective mean to waive governmental regulation for NGN in an increasingly regionalized telecommunication market under the current regulatory framework. I will finish with 2 suggestions how the current framework could be adjusted in order to actually strengthen the concept of open access. As I said, the first problem is, if I was asked to talk about open access, I asked myself, what is open access? The problem is not only that it seems to be a completely unclear idea, but also that the term open access has been used in a totally different concept for at least 10 years in intellectual property law. Generally speaking, in the field of intellectual property law, open access seems to refer, and I'm not an expert in IP law, seems to refer to the free access to information. The concept of open access has gained some importance in the field of intellectual property rights, referring to software under the label open source, even though that seems to be something slightly different. More prominently, however, the concept of open access has attracted attention in the discussion on the free access to academic or scientific information. It's important to realize that open access in our context differs in 2 ways from the concept of open access in intellectual property law. First, open access can comprise access to information and services, but more importantly, it refers to the access to the physical NGN infrastructure. Second, at least as far as I can see, open access in our context does not mean free access to the infrastructure. At least as far as I can see, nobody has proposed such an access free of charge so far. If you're then trying to find a core concept that is shared by the Bundesnetzagentur and by the EU and by the market players, you can find something like open access at least refers to contractually network access that an infrastructure owner grants to competitors based on a non-discriminatory and transparent terms and conditions. Primarily, open access seems to be granted to such competitors that are telecommunication service providers but are not content providers. I will structure my further remarks on this admittedly rough definition. If you keep in mind that open access is seen as a mean to reduce regulation, at least in this context here, it would be more precise to use the term negotiated access maybe as opposed to regulatory imposed access. However, in order to avoid additional confusion, I will just stick with the term open access here. From this very general definition, it's not self-evident why we actually should pay attention to something like open access. Actually, there are good reasons to believe that open access in the above-mentioned sense might have some clearly negative consequences, and we have heard a little bit about this yesterday. I always get a little bit skeptical if competitors start competing with each other and meet to agree on certain terms and conditions of the way they are competing. The reason for this skepticism, for my personal skepticism, is rooted in the German energy regulation. At the very beginning of the sector-specific regulation of energy markets, the German legislator had enacted a regime of voluntary negotiated network access based on so-called Verbändevereinbarung, which created, at least in some respects, a kind of an open access regime. From today's point of view, these Verbändevereinbarungen apparently were a great way for the market players to collude in public without regulatory oversight. This prepared the ground for something Ms. Hensler-Unger has to deal with today with energy markets. We are highly concentrated and have to be regulated even more severe than they had to be regulated at the beginning. Even if I set aside this general skepticism, the question is, what is so new about open access? From the very beginning of the telecommunication regulation, infrastructure owners have been free to give access to competitors based on contractual relationships. And as the mobile telecommunication sector shows, companies have increasingly taken advantage of this possibility since it is more efficient to sell existing excess capacity of a network to competitors rather than not using it at all. The key point of open access as we are discussing it today is that it is not meant as an additional mean to get access to the infrastructure of a company, but it's meant to be a substitute for governmental regulation, especially for next generation networks, at least as far as I understand it. So it means a reduction of regulation or waiving regulation for infrastructures that have to be built. The idea of reducing regulation is coherent with the European directives, which have always regarded sector-specific regulation of the telecommunication industry as a temporary task, which should be phased out sooner or later, and the problem is when is sooner, when is later, which should be phased out in favor of antitrust competition law. There are several reasons to believe why telecommunication policy should actually be serious about the goal of phasing out at least the ex-ante regulation of next-generation networks or waiving them at all. First, sector-specific, and here so many economists who could explain this much better than I can. First, sector-specific regulation of the telecommunication industry is extremely costly. There are high institutional costs on the side of the Bundesnetzagentur. Moreover, there are tremendous compliance costs on the side of the regulated companies. There is no doubt that these costs have been justified in the aftermath of the liberalization and privatization of the telecommunication sector. Based on the natural monopoly theory of the traditional telecommunication infrastructure, there was a clear danger of a market failure that triggered the need for governmental regulation. However, the advent of competing networks and technologies has significantly increased the potential of intramodal competition and thereby diminished the natural monopoly argument. This should be a development that at least makes us rethink the traditional rationale for the necessity of regulatory cost. Second, and we have heard about this a couple of times over the last 2 days, there are some compelling arguments why governmental access regulation at least has a potentially negative impact on infrastructure investments by all market players. The argument, I think, is best elaborated in a very simple but convincing way by Justice Breyer in the Verizon versus FCC decision by the US Supreme Court, where he was referring to the FCC unbundling rules. And here's the quote: "What incentive would the Commission's rule leave the incumbents either to innovate or to invest in a new element? The rules seem to say that the incumbent will share with competitors the cost-reducing benefits of a successful innovation, while leaving the incumbent to bear the cost of most unsuccessful investments on its own. Why would investment not then stagnate?" Moreover, Justice Breyer argues that access obligations not only diminish the investment incentives for dominant companies, but also for competitors. Or, as he puts it, again a quote, "Why, given the pricing rules, would these fledgling competitors ever try to fly on their own?" There's even some evidence, and we've heard a lot on that, so I don't want to go into details here, that access regulation has some negative impact on innovation, and you're the expert for this question, so I understand it's not completely clear what the positive and the negative effects are and how you balance them. However, the negative impact of access regulation on infrastructure investments the negative impact of access regulation and infrastructure investments, if you want to look at it from a theoretical point of view, goes back to the current cost-based price regulation, which is strongly committed, it's getting a little bit more lenient, to low prices. This focus on the static efficiency of the market almost inevitably impairs the dynamic efficiency of a market. In other words, it has a negative impact on investment. This negative impact becomes a real problem in times where we want private parties to make huge investments in new technologies in order to achieve the broadband goal, not only formulated by the German government. Hence, if open access actually opens the door for reducing the need for access and price regulation, this could actually stimulate the deployment of broadband infrastructure by private companies. Last but not least, and here I'm the trained lawyer, which, by the way, is open to economic arguments. Last but not least, there's also a pure legal dimension to the goal of phasing out a sector-specific regulation of the telecommunications industry. Imposing access obligations and price regulation on infrastructure owners always interferes, I don't say violates, but always interferes with their fundamental property rights and their freedom of occupation, both of which are protected on a constitutional level and a European level. Hence, if open access should actually be as effective as access and price regulation in protecting competition in the broadband market, the principle of proportionality requires the application of open access instead of the strict regulation. First question I have to answer is, and as the Bundesnetzagentur has put it, one thing seems to be clear: open access is not a one-size-fits-all approach. Hence, we need to first identify circumstances under which open access can be as effective as governmental regulation. This means that in the first step, we need to identify those cases in which infrastructure owners will negotiate a contractual basis for the infrastructure access of competitors in order to avoid governmental regulation. In the second step, we need to define criteria that need to be met so that such negotiated access renders the regulatory imposed access actually superfluous. Following the Bundesnetzagentur's categorization in its guidelines, there are basically three settings. The first setting, a vertically disintegrated infrastructure, provides infrastructure access to its network. In this case, open access most likely will not play a major role. Since it is the business model of such a company to earn money by giving access to service providers, there's only a limited need for regulatory oversight in such a case. The infrastructure owner does not have an incentive to hinder competition or service on the service provider level. Hence, the governmental control of such a company can be limited to an ex-post control under antitrust law in order to avoid that such a company abuses its position to charge excessive prices. Basically, that seems to be a natural open access regime. An infrastructure provider that is vertically integrated but does not have S&P characterizes the second category. For such an infrastructure provider, open access is not necessarily an attractive business strategy. Since under the current legal framework, only companies with S&P are facing the strict ex-ante regulation, infrastructure providers without S&P do not live with a relevant regulatory threat that make open access an attractive business strategy to them. Of course, the European Access Directives provides in Article 5, paragraph 1 for a possibility to impose access obligations on companies without SMP. However, as far as I can see, the equivalent provision in the Telecommunication Act has never been applied in Germany so far. And I have serious doubts if it could be applied in the case of broadband internets, even though I don't have a final opinion on that. My doubts are rooted in the following points. Article 5, paragraph 1 allows the imposition of access obligations on companies without SMP if this is necessary to ensure end-to-end user connectivity. This provision apparently was designed in the old circuit switch telephone world, where customer A was only able to call customer B if both of them either had the same telephone provider or the networks were interconnected. NGN differs significantly from this technology since it's packet switched. That means that end-to-end user connectivity no longer depends on a direct connection of networks or users. Hence, I doubt if Article 5 actually would provide for a legal basis to impose any regulatory remedies on a non-SMP company. This all leads to the conclusion that the incentive for a vertically integrated company without SMP to pursue open access strategy in order to avoid regulation is very limited. On a first glance, we shouldn't be too bothered by that conclusion, because we could say a company without SMP, by definition, has no opportunity to harm competition anyway. However, I will demonstrate in a second why this assessment has some flaws at least. Third category, a vertically integrated infrastructure provider with SMP. This is probably the standard case for open access. Under the current regulatory regime, companies with SMP are usually regulated because they have the opportunity and the incentive to hinder competition and to charge excessive prices. Hence, for such companies, open access can be an attractive business strategy if this helps them to avoid costly regulatory measures. However, regulatory measures can only be waived for a company with SMP if open access is as effective in preventing the abuse of market power. In other words, open access needs to ensure that a company with SMP does not hinder competition nor charge excessive prices. The question is which substantive standards an open access regime needs to meet in order to prevent such an abuse of market power. The first potential for a vertically integrated company with SMP to abuse its market power exists in relation to its competitors in the service market. Competition can be harmed by discriminating against specific competitors or by discriminating against all competitors as compared to own subsidiaries. In order to prevent such a so-called unfair hindrance of competitors, any open access regime needs to be non-discriminatory and transparent. This corresponds to the access remedies that are contained in Article 9 and 10 of the Access Directive, and which have been implemented to German law in paragraphs 19 and 20 Telecommunication Act. Inherently important for an open access regime is that the infrastructure owner gives access to third parties on a non-discriminatory basis, as defined in Article 10, paragraph 2 Access Directive. Access is only open if the infrastructure owner commits itself to apply equivalent conditions in equivalent circumstances to all of its competitors, and if the vertically integrated infrastructure owner provides services and information to its competitors under the same conditions and of the same quality as it provides for its own services. If an open access offer meets this standard, the first kind of a possible abuse of market power, the unfair hindrance of competitors, is no longer feasible and therefore can no longer justify the imposition of a regulatory access remedy. Additionally, however, an open access offer needs to be transparent. Negotiating the terms and conditions of the network access creates transaction costs on the side of the network owner as well as on the side of its competitors. If an open access offer is sufficiently transparent, this lowers the transaction cost and thereby makes it more attractive for competitors to enter an agreement with the SMP company. Moreover, a transparent open access offer by the SMP firm creates legal security and predictability for the competitors and thereby lowers their search cost. As far as a substantive standard for the required level of transparency is concerned, I think that Article 9 Access Directive can provide for a benchmark. This means an open access offer should at least contain information such as accounting conditions for supply and use, network characteristic, technical specifications, and so on. Moreover, the open access offer should be sufficiently unbundled in accordance with Article 9, Paragraph 10, 2 Access Directive, in order to ensure that competitors are not required to pay for facilities which are not necessary for their specific service. The most demanding issue in the context of open access are the terms and conditions on the network access, especially the fee competitors have to pay for the network access. Whereas non-discrimination and transparency requirements prevent the unfair hindrance of competitors, these requirements are not sufficient to exclude the abuse of market power by charging super competitive prices. And as already mentioned, open access can only be considered to be an alternative to the traditional access and price regulation if it prevents such an abuse of market power as effective as the conventional regulatory approach. Ideally, the S&P company would demonstrate that its price for the open access equals its marginal cost. However, if an S&P company had to carry the burden of proof that the price for an open access offer does not exceed marginal cost, the potential advantage of open access as compared to the current regular regime vanishes. Most likely, this would end up in long-enduring legal disputes that we all know from the current regulatory regime. Neither does this mean a reduction of the regulatory burden, nor does this create the legal security and predictability that is necessary to create infrastructure investment incentives. And as we said, or as I said, these are the two main goals of introducing an open access regime. What could be an alternative standard? A hint which standard might be more appropriate for open access is provided in Article 12, Paragraph 1 of the Access Directive. According to this provision, NRAs must consider whether access would only be granted on unreasonable terms and conditions if the NRA does not impose any access remedy. This indicates that a more lenient standard than the cost-based standard can be applied to voluntary access agreements. However, the problem is, even though unreasonable is one of the most favorite words of lawyers, it's not a clear concept, and it's not clear what reasonable and unreasonable means, and that's probably one of the reasons why lawyers like and love to use the word unreasonable. When implementing the European directives to German law, the German legislator used the following proxy for the reasonableness of an offer in paragraph 21. If a large number of competitors accepts a voluntary offer, this acceptance is an indicator that the terms and conditions of the offer are reasonable. Setting aside the question how many competitors, and that's probably a question for economists rather than for lawyers, how many competitors need to accept an offer in order to meet the standard, the idea behind this concept seems to be conclusive. If a sufficient number of competitors voluntarily agrees on certain terms and conditions with the vertically integrated S&P company, those terms and conditions are probably close to the terms and conditions that would be available in a competitive market. Hence, the question is this an appropriate standard for the assessment of open access offers in the NGN world? The Bundesnetzagentur, the guideline seems to favor such an approach in its broadband guidelines. I think there are some problems with such an approach, at least under the current legal framework. The reason for this pessimistic view goes back to something I've talked about a couple of minutes ago. The threat to be regulated is currently an asymmetric one. Only companies with S&P have to live with the threat. In other words, it's primarily within their interest to establish a working open access regime in order to avoid costly regulation. There might be other incentives to create such an open access regime, but if we're talking about avoiding regulation, they have the incentive. 5 minutes, okay, so I will speed up. Competitors without S&P do not face a significant threat of regulation. This means if an open access offer by a vertically integrated S&P company is not accepted by a large number of competitors, the only consequence for those competitors will be that they get access to the S&P company network on regulated conditions, on cost-based price, but do not have to grant access on their own network, at least regulatory imposed network. What is so special about this conclusion? Basically, that seems to be the whole idea of an asymmetric regulation approach, which, by the way, has been proven to be very effective over the last decade. Well, I think the world has changed over the last decade, especially the telecommunications world has changed. change. First, there has been a technological change which has contributed to a significant intramodal competition. Cable, DSL, fiber, wireless technologies are, from a consumer's point of view, much better substitutes than they used to be. Second, the market has become much more fragmented over the last 10 years, and this trend will most likely continue. The asymmetric regulatory model, however, was conceptualized in the old telephone world, with the former state monopolies on the one hand and some smaller competitors on the other hand. Telecommunication markets were national, which means that the assessment of market power had to be done on a national level. Contrary to that, we can see the development of broadband patchwork today. Regional operators have started to roll out fiber networks on a regional basis. At the same time, it looks like, and I'm not an expert here, but it looks like the former state monopolists, and there are some representatives here who might confirm or deny that the former state monopolists will not cover all areas with their fiber networks. How is this market fragmentation relevant for open access? From a regulatory point of view, telecommunication markets are still determined on a national basis, even though there will be regions where companies without SMP on a national level control the only broadband infrastructure in this region. Competitors, even those that have SMP on a national level, will depend on access to the infrastructure of those regional companies. However, under the current regulatory regime, the regional companies will be not forced to give access to their competitors. This gives a chance to all kinds of opportunistic behavior. Companies that are not dominant on a national level but can control the infrastructure on a regional level have not necessarily an incentive to make an open access offer, which might limit the effectiveness of open access from the very beginning. Even more interesting, the question if companies with SMP will be regulated, even if they make an open access offer that might be reasonable, depends on the behavior of the competitors. If they refuse to accept the open access offer made by the company with SMP, the latter will be regulated. Moreover, the SMP company does not know in advance how many competitors will accept the offer. This limits not only the deregulatory potential of open access, but also is not well suited to create a level of legal security that is a precondition for infrastructure investments. I want to be clear here. This is not meant to be a general rejection of the open access idea. As a legal academic who is also working in the field of constitutional law, I strongly believe in the principle of proportionality, which I think gives market-based solutions the priority over regulation if both are equally effective. As a legal academic who sometimes listens to economists, I strongly believe that we should rely more often on market-based solutions in technology-driven industries, at least. That's not a general assumption, but in technology-driven industries, provided that we can support them with intelligent regulatory safeguards. I think there are basically two ways to adjust the current regulatory regime in a way that open access has a higher likelihood of being a success. The first way would be to, as I would call it, balance the regulatory threat. Balancing the regulatory threat by defining regional markets, so not national markets, and Bundesnetzagentur is able to do that, I think. Balancing the regulatory threat, defining regional markets, meaning that also companies which are not dominant on a national level face a regulatory threat, at least on a regional level. And if we balance the regulatory threat, I think we can rely on market acceptance as a proxy rather than we can do it now. Red, because I would favor it, even though I know there are strong objections almost everywhere, legislator and so on. If we separate the assessment of the reasonableness of behavior from the behavior of the other market players, meaning we give infrastructure companies a possibility to go to the national regulatory agency and get an approval saying, if you offer this and that conditions, we will not regulate your infrastructure. And the standard could be non-discrimination, as in the Access Directive, could be transparency, and it could be an antitrust standard for abuse, as we have it in paragraph 28 in Telecommunications Act, so not a cost-based structure. This would be another way to get open access started. I think I'm almost at the end, if I'm correct, so I skipped the rest here. And I will just end up with something, with saying, open access as network neutrality, great words. I have some doubts if the concept of open access is actually a substitute for governmental regulation. at least under the current conditions. And if open access should become a successful story, I think there need to be done some adjustments. The first adjustments would regionalizing the market definition, which the Bundesnetzagentur could do. The other one would be to introduce some kind of regulatory approval into the Telecommunications Act, which I think would be possible. And I know that the legislator sees this differently because the EU directives don't explicitly mention this tool that I propose here. On the other hand, I would say the directives only also do not prohibit the member states from introducing this tool, but that's something that can be discussed. I want to close with some remark of hope. I have followed the telecommunications sector over almost 10 years now, and personal experience is that technology, innovation, and new developments are far better suited to get rid of regulation and new regulatory approaches. No offense. And I'm very hopeful that technology innovation and technology development will go on for some time. And that's hope for you, because that gives at least 10 new conferences for this fantastic institution here with lots of topics that we are not aware of today, but will come up for sure. Thank you very much.